There is a photograph you have almost certainly never seen. It was taken sometime in the early months of 1908 in a private laboratory on Long Island, New York, and it shows a man standing alone in a vast, cathedral-like room of iron and glass. His frame is impossibly thin, his cheekbones drawn like blades beneath skin the color of tallow, and his eyes, those enormous, pale, unblinking eyes, are fixed on something just beyond the camera's field of vision. His name, of course, was Nikola Tesla. At the time this photograph was taken, he was 51 years old, and by every reasonable measure, he was the most important electrical engineer who had ever lived. He had given humanity alternating current. He had built the generators at Niagara Falls. He had demonstrated wireless communication before Marconi ever dreamed of it, and he had filled auditoriums across 2 continents with cascading arcs of artificial lightning that left audiences weeping in their seats. But something had changed in the man captured in that photograph. His collar is unbuttoned, his cravat is missing entirely, which for Tesla, a man so fastidious about his appearance that he once discarded an entire suit because a single thread had come loose, was the equivalent of arriving naked. His hands are not at his sides, but pressed flat against the surface of a broad wooden table, as though he were steadying himself against some unseen tremor. On that table, barely visible at the edge of the frame, sits a device that no historian has ever been able to identify conclusively. It resembles a copper coil wrapped around a cylindrical glass vacuum tube, connected by a tangle of wires to a large, slate-gray box that appears to be some form of recording apparatus. Whatever it was, whatever it did, it was the last machine Nikola Tesla ever built in that laboratory. Within weeks of this photograph being taken, he would walk away from the most ambitious project of his career. He would never return, and he would spend the rest of his life refusing to explain why. For more than a century, the official story has been a simple one. Tesla ran out of money. His financier, the imperious J.P Morgan, had cut his funding. The Wardenclyffe Tower project, Tesla's grand plan to transmit electrical power wirelessly across the entire planet, collapsed under the weight of its own impossibility and the ruthless pragmatism of early 20th century capitalism. It is a tidy story, a tragic one, certainly, but tidy. The lone genius, crushed by the machinery of commerce. It has been told in countless biographies, in documentaries narrated by sober voices over sepia-toned footage, in classrooms and lecture halls around the world. And it is, at best, incomplete. At worst, it is a lie constructed so carefully and maintained so deliberately that even now, more than 100 years later, the people responsible for maintaining it would prefer you never heard what we are about to tell you. Because the evidence, scattered across private letters, laboratory notebooks, suppressed patent filings, and a recently declassified archive of military signal intercepts that sat in a basement beneath the United States Naval Research Laboratory for over 7 decades, suggests something profoundly different. It suggests that Nikola Tesla did not abandon his project because it failed. He abandoned it because it worked, and when it worked, something answered back. To understand what Tesla may have encountered in that laboratory on Long Island, you must first understand the man himself, not as the marble bust of genius that popular culture has constructed, but as the deeply strange, profoundly isolated, and almost supernaturally sensitive human being he actually was. Nikola Tesla was born on the 10th of July, 1856, in the village of Smiljan, in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire and is now Croatia. The night of his birth was, by all accounts, apocalyptic. A thunderstorm of extraordinary violence broke across the Lika plateau, splitting trees, setting haystacks ablaze, and turning the sky into a flickering canvas of white and violet. The midwife attending his mother, Duka, reportedly declared the lightning a bad omen, a sign that the child would be a child of darkness. His mother, still trembling from the labor, corrected her. "No," she said, "he will be a child of light." It is the kind of story that feels almost too perfect, too neatly symbolic to be real, and yet multiple sources confirm it. From the moment of his first breath, Nikola Tesla existed in an intimate, almost sacred relationship with electrical energy. As a child, he experienced what he described as blinding flashes of light that would appear before his eyes without warning, accompanied by vivid hallucinations so real that he could not distinguish them from the physical world. He would see objects, scenes, entire landscapes materialize before him with such clarity that he could reach out and touch them, only to have his fingers pass through empty air. Modern neurologists have speculated that Tesla suffered from a form of synesthesia, or possibly temporal lobe epilepsy, but Tesla himself never described these episodes as a disorder. He described them as a gift. a direct perception of the electromagnetic fabric of reality that most human beings were simply too blunt, too coarse, too biologically limited to perceive. This extraordinary sensitivity followed him throughout his education in Graz and Prague, through his early work with the Budapest Telephone Exchange, and eventually across the Atlantic to New York City, where he arrived in 1884 with 4 cents in his pocket, a book of his own poetry, and a letter of introduction to Thomas Edison. The meeting between these two men, Tesla and Edison, is one of the great dramatic confrontations in the history of science. Edison was pragmatic, blunt, and commercially ruthless. Tesla was theoretical, visionary, and almost entirely indifferent to money. Edison believed in direct current. Tesla believed in alternating current. Their conflict would eventually reshape the entire electrical infrastructure of the modern world. But in those early months, Tesla simply went to work in Edison's laboratory, redesigning generators and motors with an effortless brilliance that left Edison's own engineers slack-jawed. When Edison allegedly reneged on a promised $50,000 bonus for this work, Tesla quit. He spent the next several years in a wilderness of manual labor and financial desperation, digging ditches for the very electrical cables his own inventions had made possible, before finally securing the patronage of George Westinghouse and launching the war of currents that would end with Tesla's alternating current system powering the entire Columbian Exposition of 1893 in a blaze of 200,000 incandescent bulbs. It was the most spectacular public demonstration of electrical power the world had ever seen, and it made Tesla, overnight, the most famous scientist on Earth. But fame was never what Tesla wanted. What Tesla wanted was something far more dangerous. He wanted to listen. The listening began in earnest in the spring of 1899, when Tesla relocated to Colorado Springs, Colorado, and constructed what remains one of the most extraordinary experimental facilities in the history of science. The laboratory itself was a barn-like wooden structure, modest in appearance from the outside, but dominated on its interior by the largest Tesla coil ever built, a monstrous apparatus capable of generating artificial lightning bolts more than 100 feet long and producing electrical discharges of up to 12 million volts. The sound alone was reportedly unbearable. Witnesses described a continuous, rolling thunder that could be heard in the town of Cripple Creek, more than 15 miles away, and that caused horses to bolt, dogs to howl, and the fillings in people's teeth to spark and sing. The smell was that of ozone, sharp, metallic, electric, so thick that it burned the nostrils and left a taste like copper on the tongue. Tesla worked in this environment for months, often alone, often through the night, wearing rubber-soled shoes and insulating gloves, moving through curtains of crackling blue-white energy with the calm, deliberate grace of a man walking through his own garden. He was not merely generating power, he was probing the earth itself, sending massive electrical pulses into the ground and measuring the resonant frequencies that returned. He was, in his own words, attempting to make the planet ring like a bell. And on the night of what most historians believe was sometime in late July or early August of that year, he heard something that changed everything. Tesla himself described the event in an article published in Collier's Weekly in February of 1901. The passage is worth quoting at length, because his language is careful, precise, and yet unmistakably shaken. He wrote that he had been alone in his laboratory, monitoring his receiving equipment, when he noticed a series of disturbances in the electrical signals being captured by his instruments. The disturbances were, he said, periodic and structured. They came in clear, repeating patterns. One pulse, then a pause, then 2 pulses, then a pause, then 3 pulses, then a longer pause, then a repetition. He checked and rechecked his equipment. He eliminated every possible source of terrestrial interference, atmospheric static, geological discharge, the electrical systems of nearby towns. Nothing accounted for the signals. They were not random, they were not natural, and they appeared to be coming not from the surface of the earth, but from beyond it, from space. Tesla was, as far as anyone can determine, the first human being in history to detect and record what he believed to be an extraterrestrial signal. He did not use that word lightly. He was not a man given to sensationalism or fantasy. He was a rigorous, methodical engineer who distrusted anything he could not measure, replicate, and explain. And yet, in that Collier's article, and in private correspondence that would not be published until decades after his death, he was unequivocal. Something out there, he wrote, was trying to communicate. Something intelligent, something patient, and it had noticed him. The reaction from the scientific establishment was swift and merciless. Lord Kelvin, who had initially supported Tesla's claims, reversed his position publicly and declared the idea absurd. Marconi dismissed Tesla as a crank. Edison, predictably, used the episode to further discredit his old rival, suggesting in the press that Tesla had finally lost his mind. The signals, they all agreed, were nothing more than atmospheric noise, the natural crackle and hiss of a planet perpetually bathed in electromagnetic radiation. Tesla was humiliated, but he was not deterred, because he had not merely heard the signals, he had recorded them, and he had begun, in the privacy of his own notebooks, to decode them. The notebooks from this period, many of which are now held in the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade, are a remarkable and deeply unsettling document. Interspersed among the usual technical drawings and mathematical calculations are pages of what appear to be transcription attempts, columns of numbers, arranged in repeating sequences, annotated with Tesla's spidery handwriting. Some of the annotations are in Serbian, some are in English, and some are in a notation system that no researcher has ever been able to identify. Tesla appears to have been developing his own symbolic language to represent something, some structure, some pattern, that he could not adequately express in any existing mathematical or linguistic framework. He never published these pages. He never showed them to anyone during his lifetime. But they survive, and they are deeply strange, and they raise a question that the scientific mainstream has spent more than a century trying very hard not to ask. What if Tesla was right? The connection between the Colorado Springs signals and the Wardenclyffe Tower project has been the subject of speculation since the 1970s. But the full scope of that connection has only recently begun to come into focus. Wardenclyffe was Tesla's masterwork, a 200-foot transmission tower erected on a 68-acre plot in Shoreham, Long Island, beginning in 1901. Its stated purpose was the wireless transmission of electrical power and information across the entire globe. Tesla envisioned a world in which energy flowed freely through the Earth itself, available to anyone, anywhere, without wires, without meters, without cost. It was a vision of almost utopian generosity, and it was funded, at least initially, by the most powerful financier in America, J.P Morgan. But the evidence from Tesla's private correspondence tells a more complex story. In a series of letters written to his close friend Robert Underwood Johnson between 1902 and 1906, Tesla made several oblique but unmistakable references to what he called the Colorado phenomenon. He wrote of his conviction that the signals he had detected were not incidental, not accidental, not the random emissions of some distant cosmic process. They were, he believed, a response. Something had detected his transmissions from Colorado Springs, those enormous, planet-shaking electrical pulses, and something had answered. Wardenclyffe, in Tesla's private conception, was never merely a power transmission facility. It was a beacon. It was an antenna. It was, in the most literal sense imaginable, a device for talking back. Morgan, of course, knew nothing of this, or so the conventional account holds. Morgan had invested $150,000, a staggering sum in 1901, on the understanding that Wardenclyffe would become the centerpiece of a global wireless communication network that would make him even richer than he already was. When Tesla began requesting additional funds, hinting at capabilities that went far beyond anything Morgan had agreed to finance, the banker grew suspicious. By 1904, Morgan had cut off all funding. Tesla was left with a half-finished tower, a mountain of debt, and a vision that the rest of the world considered delusional. But here is where the story becomes truly strange. Because Tesla did not stop working, despite having no funding, no staff, and no institutional support, he continued to conduct experiments at Wardenclyffe through 1905, 1906, and into 1907. He was seen arriving at the facility alone, late at night, sometimes staying for days at a time. Local residents reported strange lights emanating from the tower, not the dramatic lightning displays of Colorado Springs, but something subtler, a deep, pulsing blue-violet glow that seemed to emanate from the tower's mushroom-shaped cupola and extend upward into the sky in a column so faint it was only visible on the darkest, clearest nights. There were reports of unusual sounds as well, a low, subsonic hum that could be felt more than heard, a vibration that rattled windows and made the fillings and teeth ache. Cattle on nearby farms grew agitated. Birds altered their migration patterns. The local postmaster reported that his compass behaved erratically for weeks at a time. Something was happening at Wardenclyffe. Something Tesla was doing alone, in the dark, in silence, with equipment he had never described in any patent filing or published paper. And then, in the early months of 1908, he stopped. Abruptly, completely, without explanation, Tesla walked away from Wardenclyffe and never returned. He left equipment behind. He left notebooks behind. He left the tower itself standing, a skeletal monument to whatever had happened inside it, and retreated to a series of increasingly modest hotel rooms in Manhattan. where he would spend the remaining 35 years of his life in a state of brilliant, agonized, and deeply secretive decline. The official explanation, as we have noted, is financial. Morgan's withdrawal of support, combined with Tesla's own profligacy and impracticality, simply made continued work impossible. But this explanation does not survive close scrutiny. Tesla had worked without funding before. He had dug ditches to sustain himself during the years between Edison and Westinghouse. He was a man of almost superhuman determination, capable of working 20 hours a day for weeks at a time, sustained by nothing more than crackers, warm milk, and an inexhaustible conviction in his own genius. Financial ruin had never stopped him before. It would not have stopped him in 1908. Something else stopped him, something he encountered in that laboratory, something that frightened him so badly that he chose to abandon not only the project, but the entire trajectory of his life's work and retreat into a silence he would maintain until the day he died. It is at this point that we must speak about the Tunguska event, because the coincidence, if that is indeed what it is, demands to be addressed. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, something detonated in the atmosphere above the Podgamenaya Tunguska River in central Siberia. The explosion was enormous, estimated at between 10 and 15 megatons, roughly 1,000 times the yield of the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima 37 years later. It flattened approximately 80 million trees across an area of 830 square miles. The shockwave circled the globe twice. Seismographs as far away as England registered the impact. And yet, when Russian expeditions finally reached the blast site in 1927, they found no crater, no meteorite fragments, no residual radioactivity, nothing but a vast, silent, radial pattern of fallen trees, all pointing away from a single, empty point in the sky. The Tunguska event remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. The consensus explanation, an airburst from a small asteroid or comet fragment, is reasonable, but it has never been conclusively proven, and it has never fully accounted for certain anomalous features of the event, including the absence of any identifiable extraterrestrial material, the unusual luminous phenomena reported across Europe in the nights following the blast, and the peculiar electromagnetic disturbances detected by observatories worldwide in the hours leading up to the detonation. There has been, since at least the 1970s, a persistent minority hypothesis that the Tunguska event was not natural at all. Some have suggested it was the accidental discharge of Tesla's Wardenclyffe apparatus. Others have proposed something far more disturbing, that with a demonstration, a response, a message, the timing alone is enough to raise the hairs on the back of your neck. Tesla's abrupt departure from Wardenclyffe, the cessation of all his most ambitious experimental work, and the Tunguska event all occurred within the same narrow window of months in 1908. This may be coincidence. In fact, it probably is coincidence. But Tesla himself seemed to draw a connection, or at least to fear that one existed. In a letter to the editor of the New York Times, written in 1908 but never published, the manuscript was found among his personal papers after his death in 1943. Tesla wrote, in language that seems to vibrate with a barely suppressed terror, that humanity was not alone in its use of electrical force, that the planet had been noticed by intelligences whose capabilities dwarfed our own as completely as ours dwarfed those of an ant, and that any further attempt to project electrical energy through the Earth's crust or into the upper atmosphere would be, in his words, an act of provocation whose consequences could not be foreseen or survived. He urged the newspaper to warn its readers. He urged the United States government to cease all high-energy electrical experimentation immediately. The letter was never published. It was dismissed as the ravings of a man in the grip of a nervous collapse. And perhaps that is all it was. But Tesla was not a man who had nervous collapses. He was a man who saw clearly, who perceived patterns invisible to others, who had spent his entire life at the outermost frontier of human understanding. If he was afraid, it was because he had seen something worth being afraid of. Now we must turn our attention to the most recent and, in many ways, the most extraordinary chapter of this story. In 2014, under the provisions of the United States Freedom of Information Act, a researcher named Dr. Elena Vasquez, a signals intelligence historian at Georgetown University, filed a request for access to a collection of documents held in the classified archives of the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. The collection was catalogued under the designation NRLTSA 1943, and it had been classified at the level of secret since its creation in February of 1943, the month following Nikola Tesla's death. Dr. Vasquez's request was initially denied. She appealed. The appeal was denied. She filed a lawsuit. The lawsuit wound through the federal court system for 3 years before a judge in the District of Columbia ordered the partial declassification and release of the archive in 2017. What she received was a collection of 147 documents, totaling over 600 pages, consisting primarily of transcripts, technical analyses, and internal memoranda produced by the Office of Naval Intelligence in the weeks following Tesla's death on January 7, 1943. The documents revealed that the United States government had taken an immediate and intense interest in Tesla's personal effects, a fact that was already well known. What was not well known, and what these documents revealed for the first time, was the specific nature of that interest. The government was not merely looking for weapons research, as had long been assumed. They were looking for recordings. Specifically, they were looking for a set of wax cylinder phonograph recordings that Tesla was known to have made during his Colorado Springs experiments in 1899 and during his later work at Wardenclyffe between 1905 and 1908. The documents describe these recordings in remarkable detail for materials that the naval intelligence officers had apparently never actually heard. They were working from descriptions provided by Tesla's own notebooks and by the testimony of a single witness, a former laboratory assistant named Fritz Lowenstein, who had worked with Tesla intermittently between 1899 and 1903. Lowenstein, who by 1943 was an elderly man living in retirement in New Jersey, was interviewed by Naval Intelligence on January 12, 1943, just 5 days after Tesla's death. The transcript of that interview, which occupies 23 pages of the declassified archive, is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of 20th century science. Lowenstein described, in halting but precise English, he was originally from Austria, his experience assisting Tesla during the Colorado Springs experiments. He confirmed that Tesla had detected structured electrical signals of unknown origin. He confirmed that Tesla had recorded these signals on wax cylinders using a modified Edison phonograph. And he described something that no previous account of the Colorado Springs experiments had ever mentioned. He said that Tesla had played the recordings back, that he had listened to them night after night, sometimes for hours at a time, and that the experience had changed him. Lowenstein described a man who became progressively more withdrawn, more agitated, and more convinced that the signals were not merely structured, but intentional. Tesla told Lowenstein, on a night that the old man recalled with visible distress, that the signals contained mathematical relationships that no natural process could produce. Not merely the simple counting sequences that Tesla had described in his published accounts, something more complex, something that appeared to encode geometric and spatial information, something that Tesla believed was a set of instructions. The naval intelligence officers pressed Lowenstein on this point. Instructions for what? Lowenstein said he did not know. Tesla had refused to elaborate, but Lowenstein recalled one detail that he said had haunted him for over 40 years. On the last night of his employment at Colorado Springs, he had entered the laboratory unannounced and found Tesla sitting in complete darkness, the phonograph playing one of the recordings at reduced speed. The sound, Lowenstein said, was unlike anything he had ever heard. It was low, rhythmic, and curiously organic, not like the clicks and pulses Tesla had described in his published work, but something that sounded, Lowenstein said, almost like breathing. A vast, slow, deliberate respiration, rising and falling in a pattern that suggested enormous lungs filling and emptying at intervals measured not in seconds but in minutes. Tesla was sitting perfectly still, his eyes closed, his hands folded in his lap. Lowenstein said he stood in the doorway for several minutes, too unnerved to speak or move, before Tesla opened his eyes and said, in a voice Lowenstein described as completely flat and devoid of emotion, that they were listening, and that they had been listening for a very long time. Lowenstein left Colorado Springs the following morning and never worked for Tesla again. He told the naval intelligence officers that he had never spoken of the incident to anyone. He said he had tried to forget it. He said he had not succeeded. The naval intelligence team spent the following weeks conducting an exhaustive search of Tesla's hotel rooms, storage facilities, and known associates. The declassified documents reveal that they recovered a substantial quantity of technical materials, notebooks, patent drafts, correspondence, and equipment, much of which was subsequently transferred to the custody of the Office of Alien Property, despite the fact that Tesla had been a naturalized American citizen since 1891. But the recordings, the wax cylinders from Colorado Springs and Wardenclyffe, were never found, or, more precisely, They were never reported as found. The documents contain several internal memoranda that suggest a degree of confusion or possibly deliberate obfuscation about what was and was not recovered from Tesla's effects. One memorandum, dated January 19, 1943, references a shipment of sealed containers transferred from Tesla's storage unit on East 40th Street to a facility described only by a 4-digit code number. The memorandum is unsigned and carries a classification marking higher than secret, a marking that was redacted in the declassified version, leaving a black rectangle where the classification level should be. Whatever was in those containers, wherever they were sent, they were considered too sensitive for even the standard classified channels of wartime naval intelligence. They vanished into a system of compartmentalized secrecy from which they have never emerged. Dr. Vasquez has filed additional FOIA requests seeking information about the 4-digit facility code and the contents of the shipment. All of these requests have been denied, with the standard justification that the release of the information would cause exceptionally grave damage to national security. In 2023, 80 years after Tesla's death, the contents of those sealed containers remain classified at a level that exceeds the security clearance of most members of the United States Congress. But the declassified archive contains something else, something that Dr. Vasquez did not expect to find and that she has described in her published analysis as the single most significant document she has ever encountered in 3 decades of signals intelligence research. It was a technical analysis report dated March 15, 1943, produced by the Naval Research Laboratory's Radio Division. The report was titled simply Analysis of Anomalous Signal Intercepts, Frequency Band Designation Tesla, and it described a series of electromagnetic signals detected by United States Navy receiving stations in the North Atlantic during the period between 1907 and 1909. The signals had been detected by stations monitoring for naval communications and had been flagged as anomalous because they did not match the signature of any known transmitter, military, commercial, or experimental. They were extremely low frequency, in a band far below the range used by any existing radio technology. They were periodic, exhibiting a regular, repeating structure, and they were, according to the Navy analysts who examined them in 1943, virtually identical in their mathematical structure to the signal patterns described in Tesla's laboratory notebooks from Colorado Springs. The Navy had been intercepting the same signals Tesla claimed to have heard, not once, but continuously, over a period of approximately 2 years, beginning in mid-1907 and ending abruptly, on a date that the report specifies with chilling precision, on June 30, 1908, the date of the Tunguska event. The signals started when Tesla began his clandestine experiments at Wardenclyffe. They stopped on the day Tunguska exploded, and no one, not the Navy, not the scientific establishment, not the United States government, had ever connected these facts until a signals intelligence historian pried open a classified archive 80 years after the fact. The implications of this discovery are staggering, and they must be approached with the sobriety and rigor they deserve. Let us be clear about what the Naval Research Laboratory report does and does not establish. It establishes that anomalous, structured, extremely low-frequency electromagnetic signals were detected by United States Navy receiving stations in the North Atlantic between 1907 and 1909. It establishes that these signals bore a mathematical resemblance to the patterns Tesla described detecting in Colorado Springs. It establishes that the signals ceased on the date of the Tunguska event. It does not establish the origin of the signals. It does not establish a causal relationship between Tesla's experiments, the signals, and the Tunguska event. It does not, in short, prove that something answered back. But it does something almost as important. It removes the story from the realm of pure speculation and places it in the realm of documented, verified, military-grade signal intelligence. Tesla said he heard something. The Navy heard it too. And whatever it was, it stopped on the day a 15-megaton explosion leveled 800 square miles of Siberian forest without leaving so much as a pebble behind. These are facts. They are not theories. They are not conjectures. They are entries in a classified military archive recorded by trained signals intelligence officers, analyzed by qualified electrical engineers, and kept secret for 7 decades. The question is no longer whether Tesla heard something. The question is what he heard, and whether the entity or phenomenon that produced those signals is still out there, still listening, still waiting for someone else to be foolish enough or brilliant enough to switch on the machine and try again. There is one more element of the story that must be addressed, and it is perhaps the most disturbing of all. Among Tesla's personal papers, recovered after his death, was a document that has come to be known among Tesla scholars as the Memorandum on Planetary Defense. It is undated, but internal references suggest it was written sometime between 1935 and 1940 during the final years of Tesla's life, when he was living in near poverty at the New Yorker Hotel, feeding pigeons in Bryant Park, and occasionally issuing grandiose public statements about death rays and particle beam weapons that the press treated as the delusions of a fated genius. The memorandum, however, is not delusional. It is lucid, methodical, and terrifying. In it, Tesla describes what he calls a defensive protocol for the human species. He argues that the Earth is surrounded by an electromagnetic environment that functions, in effect, as a kind of camouflage and natural noise floor of atmospheric static, geological discharge, and solar radiation that renders the planet effectively invisible to any intelligence monitoring the electromagnetic spectrum from a distance. He argues that this camouflage is fragile, and that any sufficiently powerful artificial electromagnetic emission, such as those produced by his Colorado Springs and Wardenclyffe experiments, could punch through this noise floor like a searchlight-piercing fog, announcing humanity's presence to whatever might be watching. And he argues with a quiet, almost clinical desperation that humanity must never do this again. The memorandum contains detailed technical recommendations for limiting the power output of radio transmitters, restricting certain frequency bands, and establishing an international monitoring system to detect any electromagnetic emission that might breach the planetary noise floor. None of these recommendations were ever implemented. None of them were ever seriously considered. By the time the memorandum was found, Tesla was dead. The atomic age had begun, and humanity was pumping electromagnetic radiation into space at a rate and intensity that would have struck Tesla with the force of a physical blow. Consider what the world has done since 1943. We have detonated nuclear weapons. We have broadcast television and radio signals into space at escalating power levels for 8 decades. We have aimed the Arecibo telescope at distant star clusters and transmitted focus messages. The Arecibo message of 1974, a deliberate, high-powered, narrowband transmission aimed at the globular cluster Messier 13, containing encoded information about human biology, our solar system, and our position in the galaxy. We have launched the Voyager probes with their golden records. We have, in short, done everything that Tesla's memorandum begged us not to do. We have screamed into the void with every instrument at our disposal, and the void, by all official accounts, has remained silent. But here is a question worth asking. A question that acquires a particular weight in light of the declassified Naval Research Laboratory documents. If Tesla was right, if his transmissions from Colorado Springs and Wardenclyffe did provoke a response, and if that response culminated in an event of extraordinary destructive power delivered with pinpoint precision to one of the most remote locations on the planet's surface, then what does that silence mean? Does it mean nothing is out there? Or does it mean that whatever is out there received our messages, evaluated their content, assessed our capabilities, and decided, for reasons we cannot begin to comprehend, to wait? And if it is waiting, what is it waiting for? These are not comfortable questions. They are not the kind of questions that funding agencies like to support or peer-reviewed journals like to publish, but they are the questions that the evidence, such as it exists, demands we ask. Tesla spent his final years in a state that has been variously described as decline, eccentricity, and madness. He lived alone in hotel rooms. He maintained rigid, almost ritualistic daily routines, walking to the park at precisely the same time each day, feeding the same pigeons, returning to his room at the same hour each evening. He developed intense, possibly romantic attachments to individual pigeons, particularly a white female he described in terms of transcendent devotion. He claimed to have invented a particle beam weapon capable of destroying 10,000 enemy aircraft at a distance of 250 miles, and he offered this weapon to the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia, apparently unconcerned about the implications of providing such a device to multiple competing powers. The press mocked him. His former peers ignored him. He was seen as a cautionary tale, the brilliant mind that had flown too close to the sun and been burned by its own ambitions. But beneath the surface of this decline, there are indications that something else was happening. Tesla continued to work. He continued to write. He continued to conduct experiments, though on a much smaller scale and with extreme secrecy. Several of his hotel employees later recalled that he maintained a small laboratory in his room, coils, receivers, measurement instruments, and that he was often heard talking to someone, though no visitor was ever seen. When pressed, Tesla would say only that he was monitoring. He never specified what. On January 7, 1943, a maid at the New Yorker hotel entered room 3327 and found Nikola Tesla dead in his bed. He was 86 years old. He was alone. The cause of death was recorded as coronary thrombosis. His body was thin, his face gaunt, his hands, those hands that had once held captive lightning, folded across his chest in a pose that the maid described as eerily deliberate, as though he had arranged himself before dying. Within hours of his death, agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived at the hotel and seized his personal effects. Within days, the Office of Alien Property had taken custody of his remaining papers and equipment. Within weeks, the Naval Intelligence Review described in the declassified archives was underway. The speed and intensity of the government's response has been the subject of speculation for decades. Tesla was an elderly, impoverished inventor who had not produced a commercially viable device in over 30 years. Why the urgency? Why the classification? Why the involvement of multiple intelligence agencies in the review of a dead man's notebooks and phonograph cylinders? The standard explanation is that the government feared Tesla's particle beam weapon research might fall into enemy hands during wartime. And that explanation is plausible, but it does not explain the specific, focused interest in the recordings. It does not explain the sealed containers shipped to an unnamed facility under a classification level that exceeded wartime secret. And it does not explain why, 8 decades later, those materials remain locked behind a wall of secrecy that has survived every legal challenge brought against it. There is a room somewhere in the United States, perhaps beneath the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, perhaps in a facility with no public name in a location with no public address, where a set of wax cylinder recordings made by Nikola Tesla between 1899 and 1908 may still exist. They may have degraded beyond recovery. They may have been destroyed deliberately. They may have been transferred to a more durable medium and analyzed by technologies that Tesla himself could never have imagined. We do not know. What we know is that Tesla heard something. The United States Navy heard something. The signals correlated precisely with Tesla's experiments and ceased precisely on the date of the most powerful unexplained explosion in recorded history. We know that Tesla spent the rest of his life warning humanity not to repeat his mistake, and that humanity, with characteristic boldness and characteristic blindness, has done nothing but repeat it, at ever greater volumes, into an ever-expanding sphere of space that now encompasses several thousand star systems. We know that the void has not answered, or, more precisely, that no answer has been publicly acknowledged. And we know that somewhere in the classified archives of the most powerful on Earth, there are documents reporting that someone, at some point, decided the human race is not ready to hear. On clear nights, if you drive out to Shoreham, Long Island, you can still visit the site where Wardenclyffe once stood. The tower is gone, of course. It was demolished in 1917 to pay Tesla's debts, sold for scrap to a salvage company that melted it down for the value of its steel. The laboratory building survived, barely, and is now preserved as a museum and education center, maintained by a non-profit organization that raised funds through public donation. It is a modest building, brick and timber, smaller than you might expect given the enormity of what was attempted inside it. If you visit on a quiet evening, after the staff have gone home and the parking lot is empty, you can stand on the ground where the tower's foundation once sat, a broad, shallow depression in the earth, now overgrown with grass, and look up at the sky. The sky over Long Island is never truly dark, not anymore. The light pollution from New York City casts an amber glow across the southern horizon, and the stars are pale, distant, diminished. But they are there, and if you stand very still, and you listen very carefully, past the hum of the power lines and the distant rush of traffic and the electronic murmur of a civilization that runs on the alternating currents Nikola Tesla gave it, you might hear something else. You might hear what Tesla heard. That vast, slow, patient breathing, that signal from the dark, repeating and repeating and repeating, as it has perhaps been repeating for longer than the human species has existed, waiting not for us to answer, but for us to understand that some questions, once asked, cannot be taken back. The machine is off. The tower is gone. The man is dead, but the frequency he opened has never been closed, and whatever is out there, whatever heard him call, has all the time in the universe to wait for someone to call again.